Started. Um, okay, this is chapter 13. One more chapter after this, and then we're finished. Um, this one is about physical health and culture, and there is a difference between the way people um, get better and the way they don't. Genetic variability, genetic variability in humans is considerably less than in many other species, given how recently modern humans emerged as a species. Modern humans first emerged approximately 200,000 years ago, and they all lived in Africa until approximately 50 to 60,000 years ago, when some of them migrated elsewhere. Where did they migrate? They migrated into Europe and into Asia, and then eventually they came over to the Americas. Humans have become so dependent on cultural information to survive that culture has become a selective force on their biological nature. Humans are said to be a product of culture gene evolution, as they have both evolved biological predispositions to depend on cultural information. And this cultural information enhances their fitness as it continues to evolve. A common domain in which we see evidence for this selection is cultural differences in dietary practices, such as milk consumption. Different cultures vary in what they regularly eat, and long-term persistent changes in dietary practices have been accompanied by genetic evolution that maximizes the effectiveness of nutrition that people derive from their diets. Some people can't drink milk, can't consume any milk products because it makes them sick. And other individuals have no problems with it. If you think about the Maasai, some of the herding groups in Africa, uh, they commonly drink milk. They commonly drink milk every day. It's one of their staples. If we're talking about Europeans, we're talking about a culture that developed around cheese and milk products. They couldn't keep milk for an extended length of time, so they created cheese, which lasts a lot longer. They also created butter from milk products. As far as Europeans and Africans are concerned, it's very important. However, there are a lot of African Americans who are lactose intolerant. A lot of Asians are lactose intolerant. Why would that be? Well, one of the reasons is because they didn't have cows in Asia until Europeans took them over there. Cow milk, especially goat milk, of course, goats and sheep. They didn't have goats and sheep either. So they didn't really evolve consuming any milk products, whereas the Europeans did evolve uh, consuming milk products. Humans vary in the amount of starch they eat. In general, people in agricultural societies consume more starch than those in most foraging societies. And the people from cultures in which a lot of starch has traditionally been consumed are more likely to have a genetic mutation that increases the amount of amylase protein in their saliva, which helps to digest starch. And this is according to Perry et al. In 2007. So what are we talking about? What are starches? Starches are foods like potatoes are starches. Corn is a starch. Gluten from wheat. Rice is a starch. So the people that grew crops, yes, they could sustain themselves for a much longer period of time, but in order for them to consume starches at a high level, what they needed to do was develop amylase in their stomachs and in their digestive tract, which would be able to take care of all the starches. So there you go. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is the people of the Americas, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, consumed a lot potatoes and corn. Potatoes were very popular down in South America, And corn has been a staple in North America for tens of thousands of years, whereas wheat was a staple in Europe, and rice was a staple in Asia. And of course, wheat eventually made its way over to Asia. Now everybody eats everything, and some people have a difficult time um, keeping the weight off because of the amount of amylase they have. In West Africa, populations of Kwa-speaking farmers started to grow yam crops, which required them to clear the forests. One inadvertent side effect of this cultural practice was that it increased the amount of standing water after a rain, creating a better habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria then spread in these regions and led to the evolution of a particular genetic variant for hemoglobin that is associated with sickle cell anemia, which has the benefit of making one more resistant to developing malaria, which is kind of curious. So if we have if a couple who have the sickle cell trait, if they have 4 children, they will have one child that doesn't have any sickle cell trait at all, and they potentially would die from malaria. They have one child that has sickle cell anemia, which means that they will potentially die from sickle cell anemia, and they have 2 children that are pretty much resistant to the development of malaria because of their hemoglobin. And that's the way it works. Researchers around the world have attempted to identify different genetic variables that might lead to social sensitivity. 5-HTTLPR, A118G, and MAOA are alleles that have been found in Asian samples, but not in European samples. They could have something to do with social sensitivity, since Asians tend to be more socially sensitive than other people. Genetic variant that is associated with increased emotional support seeking in times of distress for European Americans is associated with decreased emotional support seeking among Koreans. A variant that is associated with increased attention to foreground objects among European Americans shows the opposite effect among Koreans. Foreground objects are things that are close to you. A variant that leads to better responses to antidepressants among Caucasians leads to worse responses among Koreans and Japanese. Now, that's really kind of weird. It looks like things that help people in the Western world, who are Westerners, who are primarily Caucasians, it damages, it does the very opposite for people in Korea and Japan. A variant associated with decreased emotion and suppression among European Americans predicted increased emotional expression among Koreans. Studies that included a sample of Korean Americans who are genetically more similar to Koreans but culturally more similar to European Americans showed a pattern of results that were more similar to those of European Americans, demonstrating that cultural experiences can actually shape how genes are expressed in the body. Dutch men average 6'1". That's 3 inches taller than the average American man, who stands at just under 5'10". In 1865, American men averaged 5'8", which was 3 inches taller than the average Dutch man at the time. So things have changed over time. The Dutch have always consumed a lot of dairy products, and well, they have since they became fairly wealthy, and maybe that has something to do with the 6'1". Americans have always had a fairly rich diet, mainly because they're in Europe, of course, the people that controlled the food were wealthy people, and if you were a peasant in Holland, potentially your diet wasn't very good. But of course, in the United States, American men in 1865, that was right after the Civil War, we were consuming a lot of meat, and we were consuming a lot of dairy products because most people in the United States lived on farms. So I guess it's logical that American men who had control over their own food would be 3 inches taller than somebody from Holland, where the peasant class wouldn't have control over their own food. In the late 19th century, on average, Americans were among the tallest in the world, reflecting their relative advantage in income, their national per capita. Gross national product per capita was the third highest in the world, and this is at the end of the 19th century. At the time, American men stood 1 inch taller than Britons, the same height as Australians, 2 inches taller than Norwegians, 3 inches taller than the French, 4 inches taller than Italians, and more than 7 inches taller than the Japanese. South Korean children are about 5 inches taller than their North Korean counterparts. Japanese immigrants to California in the 1950s were about 5 inches taller than their compatriots in Japan, and that's what we're seeing here. These are Japanese men from Japan, or men of Japanese ancestry who are from the United States, and these are men of Japanese from Japan. And as you can see, they're much taller than these guys. Dairy consumption in particular has been linked to height, so it builds strong bones. And this is one of the things that you tell your children: you need to drink your milk so you'll get nice and tall. And if you don't drink milk, then you'll never get tall. When I was growing up, there was only whole milk back then. There was no skim milk or 2% milk. And my mother, we're short in my family, obviously. I'm only 5'6", but I drank a lot of milk. I drank milk constantly. That was my favorite drink. So if I exercised or needed a drink of something, I always had a nice slug of milk. So I grew up with milk, and potentially that's helped my bones. But when I was 28 years old, I suffered from kidney stones, and they said it probably had something to do with milk. Every time I have slipped and started consuming milk again, I always get kidney stones. So I try to stay away from milk. But I used to drink a lot of milk when I was young. Japanese and Korean adults report sleeping about an hour less per day than French adults do. Moreover, these cultural differences are not just evident among adults. A systematic study of infants and toddlers in 17 countries around the world found that Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Infants from Asian countries were found to sleep much less than infants from Western countries. Dutch infants were found to sleep about 1.3 hours more than American infants. People in countries at the extreme of the sleep spectrum, Japan and the Netherlands, have a pronounced difference in the amount that they sleep. Japanese, European Canadians, and Asian Canadians were provided biometric measurements to measure their sleep. Japanese participants slept about 1.2 hours less than the two Canadian samples. Asian Canadians slept similarly to European Canadians, showing that it is cultural. And of course, this is a man on a Japanese subway, and he's put the two women to sleep, as you can see. Japanese participants indicated that their ideal amount of sleep was about an hour less than that reported by Canadians. The Canadians described themselves as feeling more tired during the day, even though they were sleeping more than the Japanese. And something, a factor that that they didn't really talk about, is the fact that Canada is a lot farther north than Japan is. So potentially there is less sunlight, and that may be one of the reasons why Canadians sleep more than the Japanese do. Until recently, socioeconomic status was invisible to health researchers. Research in 1984 of English civil servants were divided into 4 class categories. The researchers found that compared with top administrators, members of the executive class were 60% more likely to die over the 10-year period that they looked at these groups. The clerical staff was 120% more likely to die, and the unskilled laborers were 170% more likely to die. What in the world is going on here? Just because you're a boss in England, you get to live longer? Does that make any sense? And the answer is, yeah, it does make sense, and we're going to figure it out in just a second. Despite the fact that these were very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. It is actually larger than smokers and non-smokers. So the best thing to be is your own boss. You'll live longer. The same thing was observed in Denmark. The same thing was observed in Norway. The same thing was observed in Finland. The same thing was observed in France. The same thing was observed in Japan. The same thing was observed in New Zealand. So why would this be? What's going on here? Well, this is something we discovered when we started working with soldiers coming back from Vietnam. One of the things we discovered was if you're in charge, then you get to make your own decisions. If you're not in charge and you're a civil servant like these poor guys, then you have to follow orders, and following orders is much different from you have no control over yourself, and it's the lack of control that seems to have something to do with the early death rates. Why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because if you are one of those people that gets bossed around all the time, it creates aggravation, and the aggravation potentially leads to poor health. In the United States, almost every increase in income reduces mortality rates, and these differences emerge even among those incomes at the highest level. So if I've got $1 billion and you've got $10 billion, you're going to live longer than I am. And as you can see, this shows exactly the same thing for both men and women. The Fulani, Mosi, and Ramabe all live in northeast Burkina Faso. There's Burkina Faso right there. The region is endemic with malaria, which is a major cause of death in the area. The Mosi and the Ramabe have been living in this region for thousands of years and have developed much genetic resistance to malaria over time. The Fulani moved to this region in the early 19th century as part of the Islamic invasion of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fulani have not developed much genetic resistance to malaria. The Fulani are the dominant ethnic group in this area. They control the government, they control the military, and everybody else is subordinate to them. When the Fulani first arrived, they conquered, enslaved, and decultured the other ethnic groups in the area, including the Mosi and the Ramabe. The higher status that they have as conquerors appears to provide them with enough health benefits to more than make up for their genetic vulnerability to malaria. Your health may be seriously compromised if you don't have enough money to pay for adequate health care. In the British civil servant study, all the workers had the same access to state-provided health care, yet there were still pronounced differences. What were the differences? Who's in charge and who gets to decide what to do? People lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to have jobs that place them in hazardous situations, such as having to deal with poisonous toxins that make them vulnerable to workplace accidents. People in the lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to smoke, eat a poorer diet, and are less likely to exercise. Chronically stressed people are more likely to engage in health-compromising behaviors, such as smoking and drinking, in order to cope with the difficulties in their lives, and stress directly weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infections and manage other threats. People who feel that they do not have much control in their jobs tend to have a higher risk of heart disease. Low levels of control are more generally associated with poor physical functioning and an increased likelihood of illness. One study by Lockman and Weaver in 1998 found that although lower socioeconomic status people have worse health outcomes. Those with lower socioeconomic status have felt that they had much control in their lives, had levels of health and well-being that were comparable with those in higher income groups. So it all depends on how you feel about whether you're in charge or whether you're not. The more control you have, the longer you'll live, or at least the more control you feel like you have, the longer that you're going to live. Stress and feelings of a lack of control tend to be more pronounced among those who occupy a subordinate position and are subject to the demands of those who are able to make decisions for them. This is not just true of humans. Research with various primates has revealed that those individuals who are subordinate in a hierarchy experience greater stress hormone levels when the society is ruled by intimidation, as in this situation. The high stress hormones are especially true when subordinate primates are unable to easily avoid dominant individuals and when they have low availability of social support. And I don't know if this sounds like bullying to you, but it sounds like bullying to me. So the more that bullying is allowed and supported, the more likely that people will die young. The societal features that result in the greatest degree of stress among subordinates in various primate populations are remarkably similar to the situation in which many low socioeconomic status people find themselves in modernized industrialized societies. Feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. The experience of relative deprivation, of knowing that others are doing better than you, might lead to stress and its associated negative health consequences. It really doesn't matter how much money you have. If you run around with a crowd that has more money than you, you're going to feel like you're being cheated, like that you don't have any control. They have more control over you than you have control over yourselves. There's a clear relation between the absolute wealth of a nation and the average life expectancy of its citizens. This is true up to the gross domestic product per capita figure of approximately $30,000 per year. Above the per capita GDP, $30,000, the curve largely flattens out, suggesting very little relation between absolute wealth and life expectancy. Many of the countries in the flat part of the curve have average incomes that are lower than that of the lowest Americans. Yet these people don't seem to be worse off in terms of health outcomes. Let's look back at this. Who has the highest gross domestic product per capita income? It's Norway, Singapore, United States is third. And as you can see, we're way down the list. We're what is that, $13,000 less money than the people in Singapore and Norway? It's a lot of money. Anyway, poor Americans are doing far worse than wealthier Americans. Income and health is actually a relationship between health and one's income relative to those around us. So if we are around people, like I said, if we're around people that have a lot more money than we have, we're going to feel like we're deprived. But if the people around us all have about the same amount of money and I have a little bit more, I'm going to feel pretty good. Asian Indians living in the poor province of Kerala have far lower absolute incomes than poor African Americans in the United States. However, people in Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree. The Keralians are poor in absolute terms, but they likely feel less poor because nearly everyone around them is poor, so they feel better. Poor Americans often earn an income that is not that poor by international standards. However, they are poor compared to their fellow Americans, and their health suffers accordingly. Disadvantaged minorities around the world tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, and they often experience worse health outcomes than those of majority members. In particular, African Americans in the United States suffer from relatively worse health outcomes than say, Caucasians. Looking at the 15 leading causes of death in the United States, African Americans have higher death rates than that of European Americans for 12 of them. African Americans tend to be of much lower socioeconomic status than European Americans. Many of the reasons for their higher mortality can likely be explained by the socioeconomic status difference. And the three that they don't suffer from: respiratory diseases, suicide, and Alzheimer's disease. I think I've mentioned before that American Indians have the highest suicide rate in the United States, and right behind him, just by a skosh, is European Americans. African Americans don't commit suicide at nearly the rate that white Americans do. They don't have as much problem with Alzheimer's disease. They don't have as much problem with respiratory diseases. One reason may be because they don't smoke as much. African Americans don't smoke as much as European Americans, and that's maybe the reason for the respiratory diseases. Infant mortality rates among African Americans are about double that of European Americans, and these differences also hold for those African Americans who are highly educated. So it really doesn't matter whether you have money or whether you have a lot of education. Your infant mortality rate is still pretty high. Hypertension is especially high among African American men, and unlike other health outcomes, hypertension rates are slightly higher for African American men with college degrees than they are for African American men with less education. So if you're an African American man and you want to go to college, you're condemning yourself to death before your friends that don't go to college if they're African American. Strangely, the opposite holds true for African American women and for European American men and women. So if you're an African American female, then the more college you get, the longer you're going to live. If you're an African American male, you're not going to live as long as the other African American men who didn't go to college. Compared to European Americans, Latinos tend to have lower mortality rates for 10 of the 15 leading causes of death. This ethnic difference is all the more puzzling because Latinos tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than European Americans, and hence should be expected to suffer worse health outcomes. And this is known as the epidemiological paradox. The epidemiological paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. So if you're a Latino, especially a Latino, Latina, Latinx, if you're a female Hispanic, then you're more likely to live a lot longer and have better health than European Americans. And this is the epidemiological paradox. It doesn't fit in the socioeconomic status factors. Those are all thrown out the window. If you're a Latino, you're going to live longer. Well, maybe not. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans, and there are no explanations as to why. Latinos tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latinos, although they also tend to exercise less. The longer they have lived in the United States, the more likely they are to engage in unhealthy behaviors as they come to drink more, smoke more, and are more likely to become obese, like this young fellow eating that huge piece of Chicago deep dish pizza. Some cultural factors are more pronounced among Latinos, such as the high value placed on childbearing, and a good deal of emotional support provided by the community seem to provide an important health buffer. Latinos derive health benefits from cultural scripts such as simpatica and their unusually high levels of positive effect. They are happier than European Americans. In traditional non-Western societies, beliefs in the supernatural causes of illness are widespread. These range from theories that aggressive spirits, such as ghosts, cause diseases, which is the most widespread theory of disease, to accounts of witchcraft, sorcery, mystical retributions, and sinful violations of taboos. Among the Azande of West Africa, the primary cause of illness is attributed to witchcraft. Some Zande are believed to be witches, and the source of their witchcraft is believed to be a small organ in their bodies which can be inherited from their parents. Now, I want you to look at this little girl's eyes, or this young girl's eyes. Okay, we're going to talk about the Zande. She's Zande, by the way. The Zande witches do not perform any rites, use any potions, or cast any spells. Rather, witches conduct their witchcraft entirely through their minds. And here's another Zande female. When a Zande develops a slowly progressing illness, it is believed to be the result of a witch who is consuming the soul of its victim's organs, a little bit at a time. When a Zande develops a sudden acute illness, it is believed to be the result of a sorcerer casting a spell on them. And there you go. The witchy eyes of the Zande. There we go. In traditional Chinese medicine, a healthy body is one in which the dialectical forces of yin and yang are in balance. Any imbalances are believed to ultimately lead to illness. A person who has liver fire will have symptoms such as headaches, flushed face, and anger. And this illness is believed to be caused by having too much yang and not enough yin. Such an imbalance can be corrected by acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and potentially lifestyle. Western doctors often disagree with one another. There are rather striking differences between medical practices of French and American doctors. French believe in a concept of terrain or balance. This emphasis on balance shifts drug consumption away from antibiotics and toward various tonics and vitamins that are believed to strengthen the immune system. Long rests and spa visits are also viewed as an important part of the lifestyle that rejuvenates the terrain. Hospital stays are relatively long in France, about double the length in the United States for the same procedures, to provide ample time for recuperation. And you may wonder, what in the world is this a picture of? You're going to find out in the next slide. What is she doing? When the Europeans first came to the Americas, I guess it's not in the next slide. We're going to talk about it in just a minute. When the Europeans first came to the Americas, the natives often commented on how badly they smelled. This is because a common medical practice in the 17th century in France stated that bodily secretions offered a layer of protection, so it was considered unhealthy to bathe frequently. In 1976, an article in Le Monde, which is a French magazine, stated that the French hospital patient had the right to a monthly bath and a weekly foot washing. French dermatologists recommend that people, even those with oily hair, not wash their hair more than once a week because doing so causes a greater amount of oil to be secreted. Now, I've been bathing every day for probably the last 60 years. At least 60 years. So my Hoosier culture tells me that I need to bathe. And I wash my hair every day. I feel like it looks oily if I don't. But I guess I'm not French. The metaphor used in the United States by doctors is that the body is like a machine that needs to be tended to regularly to ensure that it is running well. When there are problems with the body, it is often treated in ways that you might expect to see a machine repaired. Okay, let's fix this lady. Let's take care of her joints. I'm sorry. Yeah, there we go. U.S. medicine is known as the most aggressive in the world. Surgical procedures are used far more in the United States than in other countries where malfunctioning parts are removed, replaced, and are physically altered. U.S. doctors are more likely than European doctors to use surgery rather than drugs. But when drugs are prescribed in the United States, they're prescribed at a higher dosage than any other country. It is rare in the United States for a doctor to prescribe rest and relaxation as a curative agent. U.S. doctors tend to search for an external cause of illness, such as bacteria and viruses. U.S. doctors prescribe more antibiotics than doctors from elsewhere, and Americans tend to have a greater concern for cleanliness and attempt to avoid contact with germs. And I didn't explain what that was. Okay, in France, they feel that the happier you are, the sooner you're going to get out of the hospital. So one of the things they do in France, I had a slide that dealt with this. One of the things they do in France is that they have clowns or whatever she is, and they come by and they entertain the clients. They'll go into somebody's room and they'll do whatever they do. This, I think she's probably a mime looking at her lips. Now, the other interesting thing about this picture is that this is this thing right here. This is called a rolladin, and a rolladin is kind of is a covering for the window. It's on the outside. It's made out of metal, and as you can see, it's almost it's almost resistant to combat. I mean, a bullet can barely get through there. But that's known as a rolladin. And these are windows. The European windows open like this, so that you can open them up. As interesting as that is, and his windows open, as you can see, it's pulled back. It opens from the top, not from the bottom. We had these types of windows when I lived in Germany. Anyway, they bring around clowns, and I don't know if that makes you feel better. You can look it up if you like. French hospital clowns, and you'll see pictures that look just like this. Anyway, that's the way it works. We're in the United States, we like to fix people with drugs. There you go. Okay, I'll talk to you next week.